Ding. So Mr. Rogers, what can I say about him? There's really good documentaries on his life. I think Mr. Rogers and Me was the first one I saw. Really good. It was done by a gentleman who was a producer of something at MTV, happened to be vacationing next door to him. Mr. Rogers had a property called the Crooked House on Nantucket Island. And so he talks about how just meeting him changed his life. That's the way Mr. Rogers was. His personhood, who he was, had such a powerful effect. He spent a couple of hours praying in the morning, every morning. He has a degree in theology, studied psychology, was a musician. He was, as a boy, a very lonely child. This was during the era of, well, I should go backwards a little bit. He grew up in a family where they had money. And so he and his family were true humanitarians in the community in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. This was during the time of the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby. So his parents were just very protective of him, so he was kept indoors a lot. So he didn't really have a lot of friends, so that created in him a place to make believe, to cope with stories and puppets and artistic expression. He was a pianist. He studied classical piano. In fact, that was his major. He went to, I think it was Columbia University. I'll have to check on that. But he was there first. But that's actually where he was in a fraternity, and that's where he really just didn't fit in with that lifestyle. In fact, the movie Animal House was based on that. Was it Columbia? Now I'm feeling bad. Dartmouth. Well, it was one of those famous colleges. He transfers to Rollins College in Florida. That's where he meets his wife. That's where in fact, there wasn't a good music program, so he transferred down there, and he was fitting in there. He did have a friend back in childhood where their house had the only air conditioner. He had issues with his lungs, and so he and a friend who had the same condition spent a summer pretty much at their house with an air-conditioned house. And that friend was quite athletic, kind of the opposite of Mr. Rogers, although Mr. Rogers swam every day. And so he was an athlete in that sense. He made friends. He was able to make friends with just about anyone. And we'll tie this in with what I think helps us today. He is studying and about ready to graduate, and TV had just been invented, and he decides to tell his parents over, I think it was Easter break, that he wanted to go into television. And his dad said to him, "You don't even watch it. How can you go into something you know nothing about?" He'd seen enough, and what he saw was a person throwing a pie in someone's face, and it appalled him. He says, "This is a very powerful medium. I've got to do something better than this." And so from there, as you know, he gets into TV. He doesn't get into children's programming right away, actually. He actually works for NBC, the opera, any kind of opera that was on TV. He did the back producing for that. He also did the Kate Smith Hour, helped produce that. So he knew TV in the back side of things, and then he goes to, gets called to a small TV public station in Canada. And he goes up there and he does a children's corner, and it was with a woman, and I feel bad now. I'm kind of skipping out on this, but they carry something. They work together doing free films, and the films were quite old and rickety, and they would actually break sometimes in the middle. So they had to quickly come up, and it was live, they had to come up with something quick to adapt to the situation. And one time he had this puppet that was given to him, we'll call him Daniel Tiger, and there was a clock, and the film breaks, and Josie Carey, oh boy, I hope that's her name. It's funny how we run to Google for everything. I think it's Josie Carey. Josie Carey was dealing with the audience. Mr. Rogers was in back. He plunges his hand out with a puppet of Daniel Tiger and says about what time is it and makes a joke. And that's the birth of how he interacted with puppets. It was through an unexpected event where he had to adapt to come up with something. If we look at his life, his gifts and talents were probably through lots of loneliness and frustration. He said that in his family, and he wasn't really big on criticizing, but he was honest. He said that my family did not know how to deal with anger, and it was not okay to be angry. And so he would play on the piano, just music that was sounding to get anger out. And so he wanted to be able to help people do that. He studied psychology with a Margaret Farland or McFarland. Erik Erikson, what he didn't study directly, but a lot of famous people in Pennsylvania at a child center he studied with. So it influenced him. He ends up getting his degree in theology. He worked during lunch hours to get that done, and he just kept on going. And when he got his theology degree, instead of becoming a minister with the Presbyterian Church, he ends up being, in his opinion, a minister in television. And he did it in such an interesting way. He didn't overtly share the Christian message, but did it in every other way. And look at the impact he had on people's lives. Yeah, if you haven't studied it, it's so worth studying. There's a lot of talk about how we need someone like Mr. Rogers today to help us. And I would encourage you to watch all the films. They're all quite good. They all offer something different. A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood is the most recent movie. It's about Mr. Rogers, but with a fictional character that was a combination of how he interacted with reporters. Probably most, Tom Juno was the gentleman who probably most likely, but it's a made-up character. Really well done. Didn't know whether I would really buy into it, but no, it was good. And A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood is really well done. That was the one that was probably a couple of summers ago. I watched about 2 or 3 times, but it's either Mr. Rogers and Me probably had the most interesting about his theology, about his philosophy. They're all well done. So I would encourage you to look at that. Why Mr. Rogers? Like, why bring him up? I think there's principles we can learn at, especially when trying to find comfort. If you watch any of his shows, and my wife and I, when she was working through cancer treatment, surgeries and stuff, we had somehow flipped on to Mr. Rogers, and I had always liked him. I will confess that I probably mocked him a bit and made fun of him. Not terribly, but during later years. But then you come full circle to realize what a genius he was. Everything he did was not, everything he did was scripted. He prayed over those scripts. He wanted to make sure he didn't ad lib. And that's what everybody says, that he was a good person to work with, life-changing to work with, but it was not, he had high standards, really high standards. And there were a couple of times he didn't feel like he was making a difference. And his goal was to so shape television that people wouldn't get into violence and all that. And if you look at what's happened with TV, you basically feel like he lost the battle. Yeah, you pretty much can conclude that TV doesn't really have a lot of redeeming value. His shows did. It's not that it was all bad. If you're interested, he was on a show called Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, for one episode. He basically played a minister and kind of played himself. But what's interesting is that I think that's the only show he watched. So here he's a TV personality, but does not really watch it or engage in it. And it didn't matter who he interacted with. He just treated them like a child of God. And it's not an episode, but if you want to see something fascinating, he interacts with a congressman who is going to cut public broadcasting funding. And how he just interacts, he gets $20 million just by interacting a different way. And it's so different than how we interact today. Today we believe in using force with words. We try to convince with arguments and cleverness of speech and persuasiveness. And maybe at worst, like downright making people feel stupid, incompetent, and all this language and rhetoric is pretty divisive. I don't think it's really helping. It's like one big dysfunctional family in America, where you have the mother and dad on opposite sides of the spectrum. They won't even talk to each other. And meanwhile, us kids are suffering. I don't think we're all kids, but it's, metaphors break down. But let's say that mom is the loving Democratic Party who wants to nurture the wounds of us kids. The dad, on the other side, believes that we should take responsibility and not act as victims. Because they're polarizing. Mom is getting more and more enabling. There, honey. It's okay. Okay, so you broke some windows and stole some things. Well, it's not like stealing. You probably deserved it anyway. And the dad's going crazy saying, are you out of your mind? That's stealing. And it's like, you're being just too harsh. You don't understand what the people have been through. And I could go with situation after situation after situation. Like a lot of dysfunctional parents, and I'm probably dysfunctional at some level, but they will manipulate to try to get what they want. We've had people tell us one thing and then tell us a different thing. They, for instance, mask wearing. If they'd just been honest and say, look, N95s are good for us to wear, but they're just not enough. Let's save them for the healthcare workers. But instead, they tell us that, well, they're not effective. Okay, why are the healthcare people using them? They tell us it's okay to take a cruise. Don't let that stop your life. Now, that was at the beginning. Then they tell us, no, it's not safe to leave your house. Well, which is it? And then you have the dysfunction, and this is, I'll end with this because this is supposed to be the comfort hour. They're going back in time trying to say, well, you said that the virus was not that bad. And I'm not even talking about Trump. I'm talking about anybody going back in time. You know, could it be that we all didn't know what we were dealing with? And to try to go backwards and pin someone to the wall because you said this and you said that, it's just not really smart. You know, I think humility in all of us would just help us to understand we didn't know what we didn't know, and let's be humble about it. And maybe next time, hopefully there's not a next, but there will, is we'll be more humble when we say such bold things. And I think Mr. Rogers was more okay with ambiguity. He had a really good phrase, which I like, and I use it, and it's so true. He says that if how do I put this? He says that things that are mentionable are manageable. So that's an interesting thought. That if we can't even talk about things, we can't really manage those things. And I think the first step in coming to counseling is to be able to just talk about the problems, to talk about the disagreements, the conflicts, the fears, and to not be able to talk about it is part of the problem. And I think the other side of it is listening. Mr. Rogers, when he spoke, and of course, most of us watched him on TV, and so he's not listening except when he's interacting with a guest. But we do get the sense that he listens. And yeah, no, I would recommend watching a few episodes. They're on Netflix, they're on Amazon, some are on YouTube, and just try to look for the science in it, the psychology in it. And you'll see that it's well thought out. And they're thought-provoking questions. In fact, another astounding interview is him interviewing, and I should say interviewing, Charlie Rose. Charlie Rose had an interview with Mr. Rogers. And Mr. Rogers had a love for this book called The Little Prince. And of course, the punchline of the book is that which is essential is invisible. You can't see it. And I'm not a good, I should know the quote by heart. I have family members that are much better at this. But that which is essential you can't see. And so Charlie Rose talks about this to Mr. Rogers, saying, what are the things that we cannot see about you that are essential? And Mr. Rose, Charlie Rose asked this, and Mr. Rogers, instead of coming up with a quick answer, he's quiet. You see his eyes move, which shows that he's thinking. And that's where he talks about his faith, and we kind of know that he was nervous about sharing his faith initially. He actually did an interview with a person from CBN, which went really well, in fact. But he talks about the important things in life. And then, amazing, and I should just let you watch the interview, but he then turns it around and asks Charlie Rose. And he doesn't do this without any, manipulation. It's weird. He just asks him, so, like he really wants to know. Like he says, well, what is it about you that people don't see that's most essential? And Charlie Rose, you can see him a little bit taken aback, but he gets into it. Like, are we watching an interview, or are we just watching a conversation between two people that is an important conversation? Like, they really matter to each other. It's really kind of a sacred space. So, essential is a fascinating word. We've heard like essential businesses, what things are essential, what's not essential. This whole time for us has caused us to sort out what's essential and what's not essential, what's really important, what's not important. And now that where I'm living, there is smog, really bad smoke, bad fires. People have lost their homes. People have had to re-evacuate. It's making us wonder, what do they grab with them? What, just having a place to live is essential. Having a safety, air to breathe. Having air to breathe is essential. And I was going to go walking briskly like I usually do to burn off steam. And I thought, nope, I can't do that. All I'm going to do is, I would go look at online and see that the particulate matter was like 200 and plus. And I can't just do that to my lungs. Even though I'm wearing an N95 mask. I'm looking for it. It's not here. But the N95 mask I purchased was during the fires a couple of years ago. So here I had N95 masks, a box of them. Not a whole bunch, maybe 6. So I saved them for family members if we needed them. So the question I would pose out to all of us is, what's essential? And what's really essential and what's not essential? What thoughts are essential to think? What thoughts are not essential? If we're cleaning our house, if we're getting rid of stuff, what are the things we need? What are the things that are not essential? A big concern for a lot of people are their children's education right now. And my daughter's a great educator. My wife is a great educator. So this kind of runs in my family. A lot of her family members were educators. I taught 4-year-olds for a year. I think in terms of education, like I like to learn. I love learning. So it's so easy to get in the mode of how we've always done things, like a traditional school room, recess, playgrounds. And if we, instead of try to fix problems, like how do we deal with coronaviruses and all that, social distancing, what if we step back and just ask the question, what is essential? What is it I want my children to walk away with from this experience? Well, they need people. I want them to have interaction. I want them to be able to have social skills. I want them to be able to take risks. I want them to be able to use their brain and to think things through, to know how to be safe, but to take risks. I want them to have a good education. I want them to not be behind. In fact, why not use this as an opportunity to be ahead? I want them to have some joy, some semblance of fun in life, some hobbies, some skills that bring them joy. I want them to know God, and all this is not necessarily in order of importance, but I want them to know God. I want them to know how to find the source of life and how to solve problems. And maybe even in the midst of a pandemic, political unrest, riots, issues around safety, to come up with something that could help people. Mr. Rogers was asked a number of times, what do you do when there's such a terrible situation going on? In fact, in the Mr. Rogers and Me documentary, I forget the lady's name, but she is an interviewer for NPR. She knew him quite well. And when bad things happened, she would call Mr. Rogers. And Mr. Rogers would know her by name and they would have a conversation. It was kind of like you're grounding yourself when you were in his presence. You felt better. As I did watching him on TV, I had kind of a dysfunctional growing up. He seemed to be the voice of reason, the voice of love, voice of compassion. And that's why it's an interesting study that they found that viewership, you have your preschool, then you have middle school. A lot of middle schoolers rewatch him, and early college students watched him. There was something and they think that when you're going through a difficult time that you were attracted to him because he was like giving you the basics, the essential. Yeah, actually, now that I think about it, he gave us the essential tools for living successfully emotionally. But this interviewer from NPR would call him in the time of crisis. And she would say, what did we say to our adults? But in essence, what did we say to the children? And he would have words. And what's fascinating, he didn't believe in lying or candy coating things, but putting honest appraisal of what was going on in a way that a child could understand. And this is mentioned in the documentaries, but the very first week, each theme of what was going on in the world or going on would be in a week episodes. So 5 episodes, they kind of run together. And the first week, they dealt with the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. They didn't come directly talk about it, but you have Daniel the Tiger talking with Lady Eberlin. What does assassinate mean, or something like that? And they describe it as pretty simple. Yeah, and Mr. Rogers said that his mother told him to look for the helpers. And I tend to take Mr. Rogers pretty seriously in anything he'd have to say. I probably wouldn't agree 100%, but no one agrees 100% with anybody. But I'd say I try to make it fit. And I thought, look for the helpers. How will that help me? I will say that in the last year, this pandemic, I've looked to that statement more. For instance, am I being helped by the media? Am I being helped by either network, either side, or not necessarily? What if we gauged our political candidate choice based on who is going to help us the most? When you look for the helpers, it helps you avoid all the people that are not helping. It helps you avoid the problems. And and focusing on the problems. We get sick by focusing too much on the problem. I'm convinced on that. If they're not being helpful, then I move towards the the helper. Yeah, and it's caused me to think, what can I do to be helpful to people? Because I'm not perfect and I'm not helpful 100% of the time. There's many times I have to ask myself, am I one of the helpers or am I part of the problem here? Um, yeah, no, it's a really good phrase. I like it. It's really um, interesting. I would say for my birthday, I got a couple of great books. One is his biography, which is thick and really good. Another one is his all his songs done for kids, and that's more reads like poetry. Of course, I can listen to the songs. I will say he composed the songs, and they get stuck in your head, as you're like me, and they can be helpful. Is there a downside to Mr. Rogers? Like people sometimes make fun of him. In fact, early on, people were challenging him, saying he was part of the problem in turning kids into snowflakes and making them too weak, and everybody deserves the trophy, etc. You know what? I would say that's fake news. They have not really watched enough episodes to see where he was coming from. You really can't judge him based on um, just a few snippets. That's just not fair. In fact, the story goes that he was quite nervous to do an interview with a lady from CBN, a Christian author, but still he was nervous because it would basically coming out sharing that he's a Christian, which could change people's opinion of him. And some journalists criticized him, really raked him over the coals, saying he's turning kids into non-responsible, I deserve anything for no work, etc. She came out and defended him because it was the right thing to do. And that changed his mind about an interview, and then this interview was successful. Yeah, no, if I had the time, I could easily go through episodes and show that he believed in hard work. He believed in taking responsibility for one's actions. He believed that everybody makes mistakes and we can learn from those mistakes. I don't get one sense from him that we're all going to be a winner. I get that more from other children's shows, which I won't name, but phrases like, you're a winner, just believe in yourself. All that stuff, it's like, yeah, I don't believe in, or you can do anything. No, you can't do everything. In fact, he had a number of people with disabilities on the show that aren't going to walk, but it didn't mean that they didn't have value. I think Mr. Rogers was good at helping people understand that everybody has value. And, wow, that sounds critical for me to say this, so I won't say it. But I think we should just emphasize the value that people have, and that for some reason we get misguided on that. We ignore it. We don't think about value. I was going to say a statement, and maybe I'll say it, is that some of us are shallow or surfacey. And when you do that, you start to treat people like an object, like a class, like they're a this or a that. The problem with that is then it's easier to not like them or to put them down or to make fun of them. Any kind of violence probably has roots in this, is that you have to somehow make the person not human. In fact, we watched a movie again. It's called Unplanned. Very, very, very good movie about Abby Johnson's story of working with Planned Parenthood and how she leaves Planned Parenthood and comes to the other side of pro-life. And she's talking with a gentleman who is God uses to win her over, and she, in her defense of, women's rights, and saying that, she cites Civil War, how people were treated like slaves. Well, they were slaves. They were, I was jumping ahead, with slavery, with Nazi Germany exterminating Jews. You could go on. Injustices with how people, American Indian, Native Americans were not treated well. Understatement, of course. And the gentleman, and she's equating this with women have a right to do what they want with their own body. And he basically counters with saying, do you realize that those three injustices only happen because you discount that they're people? And that's what abortion really is. Its roots are, you have to not see that fetus as a person. That's and because they have to depersonalize that, and of course we would see it as murder. Then they would have no case. They would be on the side of life. Mr. Rogers was pro-life in that regard, pro-life of every living person. And maybe we need more of that. Maybe we need more connection with people and seeing, strip away the labels. Just really get away from the labels and not even have topics that would send us into label land. Sounds like I'm talking about make-believe land now. But just talk person to person and have conversation and help people feel valued and safe and expressing opinion and listening to their difficulties. I think a lot of that goes a long way. Yeah. There's an excellent story. You got to see it if you want to. About a lady a girl, she was a little girl at the time, her mother and they were in an interview, sharing this all after Mr. Rogers had passed away. But she suffered from a brain condition that was pretty bad, where she had hundreds of seizures a day. Pretty bad. And she was going to have surgery to fix this, and it was going to involve removing half her brain, I believe. Who was going to do the surgery? Actually, Ben Carson, of all people, ran for president. Gifted Hands, the movie, dedicated Christian, wonderful guy. The mother notices that the girl doesn't have any seizures while watching Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers would talk to her. And one day, she's talking to the TV set, saying, "I'm so afraid of dying. My brother is my best friend, and I'm his best friend. And who's going to be with him if I die?" The mother is so beside herself. She doesn't really know what to do, but she feels like she's got to reach out to Mr. Rogers. In which case, Mr. Rogers reaches out more than just a photograph. That's all the mother was expecting, but with a phone call. And so there's a phone call between Mr. Rogers and this little girl. And this is before the surgery. Mr. Rogers prays for her every day, calls into the hospital. I think it's every day. The girl does slip into a coma. Mr. Rogers says, "Is it okay if I come and visit her?" Of course, the parents say yes. He comes with the puppets. And he says, "No media. This is just between me and my daughter with your permission." And he talks, and however he talks or has a conversation using the puppets, which helps her get better. Yeah, incredible story. The parents said it was like magic there. I mean, it was the supernatural power of God. He was a humble man. Yeah, we don't get a sense that he wanted fame. Yeah, you don't get a sense that he wanted. It was not about him. It was about love. It was about getting to know people. He, I think, took care of himself. I don't think that he was a martyr in the sense that he gave, and then got resentful. Maybe there's just not a sense of that. Um, I think if he struggled, it was more with disappointment that he might not have measured up to helping as many people as he wanted. Yeah, we undervalue um, the things that he offered. Not that we did this now, but there's a story where this is early on in his career. He had been on, I think, maybe a year. The little network decided, let's do a Mr. Rogers and Meet Mr. Rogers Day. Uh, I think the story is that 5,000 people showed up and they lined up down the streets, and he had time for each one of them. He was going to be on the Oprah Winfrey show, and he was specific. He was pointed. He said, do not let there be children on the set. He says, because it just won't go well. Meaning he would be so interested in the children, he would just basically have a conversation with the children. They ignored him. Children were on the set. And he says, and everybody says the interview got out of control in the sense that he really didn't talk with Oprah much. He was talking with the children. The children were talking with him, and that's how it goes. I think he talks to the child in all of us. I think that's where, when we are at our worst, sometimes we're like children. Things aren't fair. I want my way. We resort to violence, which in a sense is childish. It's very animalistic. We have other forces at work. But then we also have our best is probably when we're children, just feeling feelings in terms of not stuffing them, following the rules that our parents gave us. Hopefully our parents gave us good rules. Learning to get along, learning to take one's turn, especially with driving, learning to be patient, having a schedule. Like, now it's reading time. Now it's time for play. Now it's a little rest time. I remember as a first grader, we had to put our heads on the desk. I didn't like that, but it's what we did. Having structure seems to help. Having time for recess. Learning what we like and what we don't like. I mean, yeah, it's all right there. I think it's very fascinating, something to explore. So I would encourage you to dip into the land of make-believe, or the world of Mr. Rogers, and see what you can get from that. What's fascinating about the actor who played opposite Tom Hanks, and Tom Hanks didn't really want to do this. Like, how are you going to play Mr. Rogers? And also, I don't think he got it until he got it. And both actors, the other gentleman, boy, I should be better on names, but the guy from Wales, who is an actor who played an excellent job, he had no bearing on who Mr. Rogers was. So they had to watch episode after episode after episode. But that's actually how you can learn about him. And I think he's good medicine. In fact, I think just watching him, I would love to see studies of what blood sugars might come down, blood pressure might come down, how good stuff could get stuck in our heads. Yeah, there's very little. I can't think of one thing that I really would disagree too much with what he said to children. So, well, I wish you all well. Next time you'll see me back in the office. Maybe I'll share just a little bit about what we did today. Screen capture, and bear with me. So I went, at the suggestion of my son, to a little beach where we looked at for glass. Yeah, go figure. It was right here all along in Port Townsend. It was foggy, but better. It had rained a little bit. And we walked. Sorry for the repetitive pictures here. This is kind of how I work. I take lots of different pictures. Yeah, we just walked and looked for pieces of glass. A couple of hours. It was quite fun. So here. So with that, I will let you guys go. Have a wonderful evening, and care about you guys. And I won't sing a song like Mr. Rogers does, but I probably know it by heart. You take care. I wish you well, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.